Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're gonna have a salty conversation today, and that pun I just pulled that out of the air. By the way, that was pure improv. We have Darryl Bosshardt with us from Redmond, not only the city but also the business, and we're gonna figure out what that's all about. So, first of all, thank you for being here.
Kashif, thank you so much for having me on the program today. I can't wait to spend a little time and get into the specifics of salt.
Yeah, cool. So, I was actually a little bit closer than I am right now to you guys. Met you guys in Denver. Let's call it part way. I'm in Toronto, and out in Utah. And I met with your team there, and it was really cool that this thing that I thought, okay, it's a decision that I make at a grocery store, is so much more important and comprehensive. And I started to hear and listen, and I was blown away by what your team knew and how important this stuff actually is. So we're going to dive in and share with people. When we look at nutrition, there's your people are talking about their proteins, their fats, and what do their macros look like. Then they're getting into supplementation and how much vitamin D do I take and how often. Then we're getting into like NMN and mitochondrial support and urolithin A and carbon 60 and all this cool stuff. And one area where we're constantly missing the target is minerals. People don't even think about this. Our food is dead, soil is dead, it's mineral depleted, and so we're not getting these key elements that our body needs to fire all these jobs that it does. And I'm learning so much more how important salt is. But anyways, we'll dive right into it. Tell us about what's going on with Redmond.
Yeah, so salt is one of the most misunderstood minerals on earth. For thousands of years, salt was essential for life. It was a source of trade. Every religious text talks about the importance of salt. The old saying, is a man worth his salt, was because Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt as a wage. So the term salary is saline based. And this idea, is a man worth his salt, was because you were paid in salt. And if you weren't working hard enough to earn your keep, you weren't worth your salt. So, in order of importance, we have oxygen, which is, we know that's essential for life. Then we have water, and then we have salt. And it's so important, but yet, as you pointed out, it's overlooked. People hear salt's bad for them, but the first thing that happens when you walk into the hospital or get rolled in is you're going to get an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. In fact, an IV of distilled water, tap water, an IV of coffee, although it sounds good in the morning, that would kill us. It has to be saline solution in the right ratio, and it's always been that way. But yet, just like fats went through this phase where everybody thought that all fat was bad,
Yeah.
salt went through that same journey.
So everything got demonized that's actually good for us. And we ended up into like a loaf of bread carbohydrate lifestyle because that's all that was left. And you wonder where this news came from. Before we get into any conspiracy theories, people can they can figure that out on their own. So why is it so important? Because I would argue that most people aren't thinking beyond the satiety of the palate and it's just the flavor. Like why does it matter?
That's a great question. And when we think of our bodies, the only difference in you and I visiting 1 minute and then being dead the next minute, outside of a spiritual discussion, the only difference is the absence of an electric current. So my hand moves because of an electric current that flows through that tells my hand to move or my heart to pump. So our bodies absolutely have to be able to conduct electricity. And distilled water is a very poor conductor of electricity. So the whole idea of an electrolyte is something that allows the body to be conductive. And so that's why you can drink all the distilled water in the world, but your sweat is salt, your urine is salt, our tears are salt. So we are saline solution in motion, and we're always flushing electrolytes out of our body. And the salt's job in the body, there's many, but one of the main jobs is to help regulate intercellular and extracellular fluid through the sodium potassium pump. So our body draws in and balances fluids with salt. Now, we can talk about why that is a problem when we start talking about some of the chemicals that are added to salt, but our bodies are literally saline solution in motion, and without salt, our bodies will die.
Yeah, I remember sitting with a cousin of mine some number of years ago, and he was sprinkling salt into his water. I said, "What are you doing? That's disgusting." And he said, "Well, it helps me like retain the water. You don't actually absorb it." But he was using like white table salt. right? So there's everything you said, yes. Then what do we actually think salt is, versus what's available to us? And that's a whole. This is where my eyes open, because I myself was, yes, I used my electrolytes. I was using some great products that are out there. Then I tried what you guys had, and I saw the brick, like I saw the actual salt stone sitting there. So let us know a little bit about where salt was and what it now is, and what we actually need to know.
Yeah, if we went back, a few thousand years ago, salt looked very different than it does today. And our ancestors' version of salt would be very different from walking into the grocery store and buying a canister that has all kinds of stuff added to it, that has an ingredient label. That's very different from what our ancestors. So, in a discussion on salt for the human body, we're talking about a specific salt, which is sodium chloride based. Now, in chemistry, any chemist knows there's a lot of different types of salts. A salt is an acid and a base that are bound together. So magnesium sulfate is a type of salt. Today we're talking about primarily sodium and chloride salt. So historically, that comes from oceans. Now, oceans can be a current ocean, like the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mediterranean, the Sea of Japan. It could be a dead sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel, or the Dead Sea here in Utah, called the Great Salt Lake, which is an ancient seabed, an old seabed that has been cut off. Or it could be an ancient seabed, a seabed that occurred eons ago. People are familiar with the Himalayan deposit that occurs in Nepal and Pakistan. That is an example of an ancient seabed. There's a similar deposit in Bolivia that is an ancient seabed. And here in Utah, there is this crystalline structured salt. It was actually the original Canadian salt because when Pangea was the supercontinent, as the continent was together, the northern part of the continent of Pangea created a depression, and millions of gallons of salt water covered this inland sea covering Utah, Colorado, parts of Idaho, this massive inland sea called the Sundance Sea. The seabed was then cut off and the water evaporated, leaving this ancient seabed, very similar to the Himalayan or the Bolivian pink salts. So salt that our ancestors would have found would have come from one of those ways. They would have watched the animals and they would have found the ancient seabed because the animals would have found the salt. Or if you and I lived on the coast of the Mediterranean, we would have gone out into the ocean. Ocean water occurs at about 3% salt. 2 to 3%. Our bodies are one, so the reason it stings our eyes and burns our nose is it's 3 times saltier than we are. So we would take that seawater and start evaporating the water off. And we would bring that water into a clay lined pond. We would use a gray clay because if it's just sand, then the water seeps back into the soil. If we use a gray clay to line that pond, the water stays and that water goes from 3% to 4% to 26%. At 26%, salt is at max salinity, meaning it can't hold any more salt in the solution. So the salt crystals will fall out of suspension, and then we can rake up those salt crystals, and we get all of the mineral salts in the seawater, sodium chloride primarily, but potassium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, iodine, selenium, zinc, phosphorus, copper, many, many minerals are in this solution. And we rake that up and we get not only the salt crystals, but we get some of that gray clay. So we get this beautiful Celtic or French gray salt from the seawater mixed with that mineral clay. The same process in Hawaii with red clay, and we would end up with Hawaiian red salt. So those are the two primary sources of salt. Now, if we went back, thousands of years ago, that's how all of our ancestors and all animals would have found the salt that we need to live on. And it was so valuable that in the times of Rome, when it was at its heyday, these Roman soldiers were paid, and it was almost ounce for ounce valuable with gold because it gave life. It was so important. So now we fast forward, and salt's processed in this terrible thing that we hear that we should eat less of. So what happened? Well, if we went back before the refrigerator, you and I would have eaten more salt because everything we ate outside of season had to have been preserved in salt. So our kimchis, our sauerkrauts, our fermented veggies, even our meats, we would have used salt to preserve because salt will suck that moisture out of the meat. So Salt companies did two things that changed the nature of salt. So the first one is salt companies realized that the seawater isn't water and pure sodium and chloride. It has potassium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, which are all important electrolytes that actually help offset the sodium in our bodies. If we went back in time and we watched how salt was always collected by our ancestors, it was in this single pond, this single setting. Well, scientists discovered that they could take the seawater and they could transfer through a series of evaporation ponds with a different membrane or a different liner, and they could leach off the potassium chloride. Then they can move the water to the next pond and pull out the magnesium chloride. Move it to the next pond, pull out the calcium chloride. So through a series of ponds, they could start to change the nature of salt. Similar, if you and I discovered a way we could take an orange and we could somehow suck out the ascorbic acid and then still have the orange left over, doesn't mean we should do that, but that's how salt started to change. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is salt in nature is hygroscopic, which means if I have a salt crystal and I have it on my counter in a humid, wet day, that salt crystal will actually suck water out of the air and make a pool of water under the salt crystal because it's hygroscopic. That means if I have a shaker of salt and it's sucking water out of the air, the salt crystals are going to get sticky and it's going to kind of clump. So we could put some rice in the shaker, or we might have to take it and break it up a little bit because it clumps up. Well, a group of scientists and salt companies got together and said, what chemical could we coat this crystal with to stop salt's ability to interact with moisture? Keeping in mind, salt's job in the body is to regulate moisture. They said, what chemical can we coat the crystal with to stop its ability to interact with moisture? And they came up with a whole list of chemicals. One is called yellow prussiate soda, which is sodium ferrocyanide. Another common one that's used is sodium silicoaluminate. There's another one that's called propylene glycol 400. So there's all of these chemicals that they can add to a salt crystal to make it so when it's raining outside and humid, the salt won't clump. And so it's these two things that really change the nature of salt. First is this demineralization, taking away some of those trace elements that are valuable to leach and sell off. And then the second problem is a list of chemicals. And so if you ever look at your salt shaker and there's an ingredient list, that should be your first indication that that probably isn't something you should be putting on your eggs every morning.
Yeah, and those chemicals you described did not sound very tasty, and they didn't sound nutritious. They sounded like poison. So it's they're not things that I want to ingest. And this is so common when we think about. We're lucky that on a salt label it's actually listed because a lot of these processing chemicals never get listed. They're not considered ingredients. They're considered, industrial processing, and they're not actually part of the food. It's got down to stripped down to what it now is, stripped of its minerals. That's the thing now that is considered unhealthy. So when we hear the narrative of salt is not good for you, reduce your salt intake, the doctor will tell you salt causes hypertension and heart disease, etc. They're referring to this Frankenstein that we've created, not what you can go mine naturally from its original source.
You're absolutely right. There's two parts of that. One, even if you have high blood pressure and water retention, you're still going to get an IV of saline solution when you go to the hospital. And so it's not the salt itself that's the problem. Unless you're on dialysis or you're having kidney failure, our bodies, because of the nature of how we've evolved over the millennia, are processed or are able to process about 4 ounces of salt in our kidneys per day. That's a massive amount of salt. So it's not the salt that's the problem. However, salt is also a great preservative because of the way it stops water activity in foods. So one of the challenges, especially when this salt study was done in the 1950s, that kind of pointed the finger at salt as being a problem, they were using high amounts of salt to make food that should not be eaten in the first place last way longer than it should. So if somebody's eating out of boxes and cans, yeah, they're probably getting more salt than they need, but the salt that they're getting is also this processed salt. So it's a twofold problem. But once you start eating clean, the reason that salt was always so valuable, and words like, there's a scripture in one of the religious books that talks about is salt. If salt has lost its savor, it's good for nothing. And how important salt is. It was used as a source of trade. It was used in religious ceremonies because it actually gave life. But if you take salt and then you change it and you process it and then you put it on foods that you should not be eating in the first place, then the salt is a problem because of the food and all the other junk you're eating. But it's like you said, it's this Franken salt, not this natural salt that our bodies are designed to use and to process.
Yeah, and you're when I was visiting with your team in Denver, they mentioned like you'll see an animal, and this is one of the ways that you'll actually find a salt mine is they'll find an animal going and licking a stone, looking for salt, like they're craving it. The intuition is this is what I need in my body. And having said that, what you guys are doing, we talked about pulling salt out of the sea and these ponds and how they extract it. I saw images of what you're up to down there in Utah, right? And you've actually uncovered a deep mine that you actually go into, and like you can, the walls are salt. You can go lick the salt off the walls and get your electrolytes for the day. Oh, how did that even come about?
So that's a really fun story. So in central Utah and in Utah in general, people think of the Great Salt Lake that's here in Utah. The Great Salt Lake is a relatively new deposit. It was left by a lake called the Bonneville Sea, which was relatively early or relatively late in geologic history. The deposit that the real salt comes from is from an ancient seabed. As the early settlers were coming through the west, there was my grandfather and his brother, actually their great grandfather, had a farm in central Utah, and there was little outcroppings of salt north and south of their farm that actually they had seen the local animals, the deer, eating this, like you said, licking the soil. And so they moved the soil out of the way and realized that this salt, this crystal salt from this ancient seabed during, geologists say, the Jurassic era is when the salt was laid down, was pushed up and the animals were eating this salt. And it just happened to be there on the edges of my great grandfather's farm. So in the 1950s, my grandfather and his brother were farming the same piece of ground that their father and grandfather had farmed, and there was a big drought, and the farm wasn't doing that well. And they knew there was salt north and south of the farm because it kind of had outcropped, been pushed up. So what they did, in World War II, my grandfather was a business manager and a riveter at McDonnell Douglas in California, and his brother was a miner at the big copper mine here in Utah. And so they had some business and some mining experience. And so when the farm wasn't doing that well, they took out a little loan, didn't tell their wife at the time or their wives at the time, and um, bought a bulldozer and some mining equipment, and they bought some big steel rods and they pounded it down through the field to see where this salt deposit came closest to the surface, and bulldozed the corn and the alfalfa out of the way and started selling salt initially to local farmers because all animals have to have salt or the birth defects increase, the health of the animal drops substantially. And so that's kind of what got them into the salt business, and mostly, like I said, selling it for cows and for horses, and selling it to for the roads because salt will melt ice on roads. And then, we as a family, because we were probably too cheap, we used the salt ourselves in our own kitchen. But at the time, in the 1950s, everybody thought that white flour was good, white sugar was better. And if you saw regular, like if you milled your own wheat and you saw the germ and the husk, you might think the flour's gone bad because it's got all these flakes in the flour. And so the family thought, well, nobody's going to want to buy this dirty salt. It's this rosy pink color. And then a nutritionist actually came through from California and got a tour of the salt mine. And we didn't think anything of it. He goes back to California, and then we started getting all these phone calls from health food stores wanting to buy salt. And we thought we better, put it into a prettier jar than, the bag of the burlap sack that we would sell it to the local farmers with. And so the family sat around and said, "What do we call this?" It's not it's red. It's salt from Redmond. There's three red mounds behind town, and so the town is called Redmond. But what do we call it? It's got to come up with some type of a name. And they kicked around a few names, and somebody said, "Well, I don't know what to call it. It's just real salt." And that's how the name was born. And so I wish it was something more scientific or special, but it was just
Well, I mean, the moral of the story is it doesn't matter how far back you go in time, you still have to ask your wife if you can get a loan.
that's true.
I caught that one. Sounded very familiar. So, so yeah, and this is awesome because now when I looked at the profile of what you guys are mining there, there's this belief around Himalayan salts being sort of called the status quo, or the gold standard right now. And then I looked at the mineral profile, and it exceeds what we're getting from overseas, right here in the backyard. So, what does the mineral content actually look like?
Yeah, great question. All of the salt from wherever you find it is going to be very similar. So, geologically, although any particular analysis might look different from Himalayan or the Bolivian or even some of the current ocean quality salts that haven't been demineralized, they're really very very similar. So, what I suggest people do is ask themselves just three questions. And I think when you're looking for a great salt, these three questions will help you find a good quality salt. If you're looking for a great, source of eggs or kale or steak or fish, whatever it is, I think these questions will get you there. And obviously, I'm a little biased. I think the Redmond real salt is some of the best in the world. But there's other good products out there. And in fact, if I lived in Nepal, I don't think I would spend the money and the food miles to bring this beautiful salt from Utah all the way to Nepal because they've got a really good option there. And if I lived in Bolivia, I probably wouldn't take this, money or the food miles to import this beautiful salt from Utah down to Bolivia because they've got a good source there as well. So the questions, the first one is who is producing it? Today, as you know, that gets really difficult with all of our food sources today. And with salt, it's particularly difficult because if we walk into the grocery store, we go to Loblaws, we, stop into, Kroger's or wherever we're doing our shopping, and we buy just some canister of salt, knowing who actually made that is extremely difficult. But I think it's important, which is why I love farmers markets and ways to meet the suppliers. Because if you know who's actually producing it, then you can ask the second question is where is it coming from? Unfortunately, we humans haven't been the best stewards of this planet that we call Earth. And, if you go back, it doesn't take too long to find things like the BP oil spill and Exxon Valdez and the Japanese meltdown and cruise ships that tip over and sink and water being the universal solvent. It would be really important for me if I was getting my salt out of the Gulf of Mexico to not do that during the BP spill. Or if I'm getting mine from the coast of Japan, I don't want to be getting salt from the coast of Japan when there's a nuclear meltdown in the area. And so the source, I think, is really important. And the only way to know that is to know who's producing it because you can look the person in the eyes and ask them. In the Himalayan region and the Nepal region, there's hundreds of mines that produce all of that salt, and oftentimes it comes down as commingled and then it's shipped to a big box store. And so knowing what particular mine or supplier a particular shaker came from, unless you live in Nepal or in Pakistan, is going to be pretty difficult. And so that's one of the reasons I think shopping local makes a lot of sense. And now I'm not opposed to importing, and I think I love quinoa and I really love chia seeds, and I don't have any suppliers here, so I have no problems importing those. But if you have access locally, I think it's a good place to start. And then third question, so we know who's producing it, we know where it's from. Then the third question is what are they doing to it? Are they taking anything out? Are they putting anything in? And I think if we ask ourselves those questions, you might end up with Redmond real salt, and I'm delighted if you do. It's a good product, but you might find another great product out there that would be just as good or almost just as good. Um, but again, I'm a little biased, but I think those questions will help us make better food choices and better supplement choices, as I'm sure you can attest to.
No, for sure. People understanding the value in this goes far beyond what is my salt or where's my, but it's the nutrient density and the nutrient content that your body actually requires. Salt being a staple, like water, it's something your body just needs, which you're not getting from the stripped down, broken down salt that is industrialized. It's a need, and if you don't get it, then you need to replenish and supplement with minerals, which most of us aren't doing. And you wonder why you have no energy and the systems aren't working, and there's always brain fog and everything, the world sucks. It's because you're not nourishing your body the way it should be.
I loved how earlier you mentioned cravings because I think our bodies and animals are really smart, and I think over time, because of this instant access to food, our bodies have gotten worse at reading cravings. Where we might think we're craving sugar, what we're really craving is salt. And what we might think we're craving a big soda or a big energy drink, we're really craving water and a good source of fat. And so I think as we start living a little more intentionally and listening to our cravings, like all of the animals have seemed to do a better job than we do. I mean, most people are walking around dehydrated because we forget to drink. But yet our cravings for fat and sugar is actually misunderstood a lot. And so I think if we get better when we think we're craving sugar, if you actually just put a little piece of salt under your tongue, if it's good clean salt, it'll taste sweet because our bodies actually oftentimes, just like most of us are dehydrated, most of us probably are on the low salt side of things that keep us from functioning at an optimal level.
That makes a lot of sense. And at the genetic level, there's a gene called MC4R that regulates satiety of the palate. And we find that some people are not doing well there. And so after they're done their meal, they may be full, but they're not satisfied. And these are the people that are grazing at the pantry looking for the Doritos and the cookies to get that wow factor. And it's actually the opposite. It's more like it's not a thing that makes you eat more. It's actually a thing that makes you seek out variety to eat the right things. Because the hack to stop this is to create that soupy, salty, crunchy, sweet, give yourself all the texture so that it signals back to the brain, I got nutrient density, I got everything. Right. So, whereas it seems like this is a problem, it's actually a coping mechanism, a survival mechanism to seek out variety, and it's very important to add salt. So now when somebody goes and has their meal and they still have that craving or desire for that salty food, let's call it, right? Their savory desire is still there, and like I need some chips, I need some crackers. What's happening is that's just like the deer licking the salt. Why is it licking it? Not because it didn't get its Doritos today. It's because that's where it gets its minerals from, right? And if your body is saying that I know you ate, but I don't see what I'm looking for here, right? You gave me a bunch of fluff. I'm still going to signal to you, go get more, because I don't see the copper and I don't see the zinc and I don't see all the stuff that I need. Go lick some salt, right? you know.
And your testing, can you help people, give people some solutions for that there at the
Yeah, yeah.
DNA company?
So if we know, so satiety is signaled both in the palate and there's satiation of the gut itself and the gut understanding whether it's full or not. And people do these at variable levels and sometimes need adjustments. And so if we know why your eating habits are off, not what they are, but why, we then know how to intervene. Which, if it's the palate, it usually has to do with creating variety, getting some high quality salt, getting some high quality fats, something soupy, something crunchy, giving yourself the variety to signal satiety to the brain. It's like, oh, I got enough variety to get my nutrition. And so it's there's little hacks like that. But again, the hack is unique for each individual. So we work with people on an individual level for sure.
Wow, that's I think going to be super powerful because I think cravings and listening to our bodies are one thing because of the instant abundance to food and the instant ability to get rid of cravings. Our bodies have we've gotten less in tune with that our all of our ancestors and the animal kingdom have, but we seem to have overlooked it. And oftentimes we forget to drink, but I think the cravings for fat and crunchy and salt are almost universally misunderstood. And oftentimes, if on that first sign of a headache, rather than thinking, "Man, I must be ibuprofen deficient," when you're when you have that headache, it's likely a sugar, a fat, a salt, or a water that's out of balance. This craving for potato chips or French fries or some non-healthy version of food that we're going to try to use to stop that craving.
Yeah, you're right on that. The craving isn't the problem, right? Craving is your body signaling that it needs something. The context is the problem. This craving, you have to rethink of it as what context were your ancestors in when they had this craving? What were their options, right? Because when a deer has a craving in the forest, how many obese deer do you see, right? How many deers are insulin dependent? Right? they're they're when they get their craving, their options are limited to whatever their 1,000-year-old ancestors used to have as options, and they're getting exactly what they need. When you take a craving and misunderstand that as I need a snack, let me go to the pantry and open up a package of something that's full of sugar or full of the wrong salt, versus I need a sip of water, I need like minerals, I need some salt. So that context shift makes a lot of people sick. Don't ignore the craving. It's a signal. Your options are the problem, not the craving itself. Having said that, I learned something really cool from your team, which is because salt is so satiating, right? It gives you that sense of wow. And because it's so mineral dense, that you can hack a fast and skip a sort of round of hunger by just licking a salt rock and allowing yourself a few more hours of getting through it, because you've tricked the brain and the palate into getting satisfied, and you've delivered minerals without adding calories.
You've hit the nail on the head. A lot of people today are seeing the value of intermittent fasting, but if you've never fasted before, that intermittent fasting can be really hard the first few times. And one of the challenges when you start to fast initially is in our blood we have glycogen, and every gram of glycogen, which is kind of the energy storage that's kind of always running through our blood, each gram of glycogen has 2 to 3 times that amount of water attached to it. And so when we start to fast and those glycogen levels drop, we actually lose a lot of water in our bodies. So we'll start to lose water, and with water we lose the minerals. And so a lot of people when they first start fasting or move into ketosis, they call it the keto flu, because they'll get headaches, you get nauseous, you just start feeling like crap. Because as our bodies will start to deplete those glycogen levels, our water and our mineral levels start to drop really quick. And so by adding just a little bit of salt and water, or like you said, just licking a salt rock, that not only adds that mineral and salt back in, but it allows us to take what would be a miserable fast, and you don't notice it near like you would, because the body, most of the time, most of us have plenty of calories to get us through a few days, but we don't have the salt storage and the water storage to do that.
If you want to keep diving deeper with your prescription for life with the Unpilled podcast, make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. I've also written my first book, The DNA Way: Unlock the Secrets of Your Genes to Reverse Disease, Slow Aging, and Achieve Optimal Wellness. It's now available for pre-sale on Amazon. Take a look and enjoy, guys. See you next time.
And I can tell you right now, I'm fasting for a Islamic tradition called Ramadan. Ramadan is 30 days of fasting. So that started last week. When I say 30 days, it's sunrise to sunset. So in Toronto, that's like 6 a.m. till about 8 p.m. daily, right? And I intermittent fast regularly, so the hunger's not really a problem. It's just I'm doing it during the day as opposed to in my sleep right now. And on day two, I received a package from someone in your office with a lot of goodies, including the electrolytes. And so all I've been doing is a glass of water with electrolytes at 5:30 a.m. and another glass at 8 p.m. and I'm fine. My activities are also obviously balanced. I'm not running a marathon every day during the day. I'm going to the gym right before I break my fast in the evening, and I've noticed a pronounced difference in, call it, hydration and thirst levels. I've been able to manage it every year regardless, but it's there. It's not there this year. Like, it's not, it's thirst is just isn't a thing right now. And it's literally I'm having a little bit more, but even just those 2 glasses of water I feel like would have been enough.
Yeah, our bodies are, I mean, our bodies are amazing. And I think as we, again, kind of listen to our bodies and get more familiar with what is this, I'm feeling a craving, what does it mean? And I think just that little bit of a pause between the stimulus of I'm hungry for something and, like you said, going to the pantry and eating a bag of chips or a whole sleeve of cookies, thinking, what does this craving mean? Am I hungry, or am I just thirsty? Am I really craving a candy bar, or is it the fat that's really what my body needs that I might get from an avocado, or a nice piece of meat that has more fat content to it? So I don't know. I think it's just a really powerful idea to, if we can be more intentional, and it's something that I'm not great at it all the time. I mean, I sometimes I'll get a craving and I'll go and grab some potato chips, but when I'm more intentional, I can stop and say, okay, maybe it's a salty avocado is really what I need, because it's the salt and the fat after a long bike ride, not all the processed foods that we've kind of grown up being around.
Yeah. So can somebody actually buy a salt rock like the one that you just licked?
Yeah, we do sell them on our site. We sell a little bag of salt crystals. There was a book years ago written called "Water and Salt: The Essence of Life," and in her book she talks about making a solé, which is a salt solution. And before her book, there was a book years ago called "Your Body's Many Cries for Water" by a guy named Dr. Batman Gelly. And he told all of the readers of his book to add a quarter teaspoon of salt in a quart of water at a minimum and drink that every morning. Just a quart of water with a quarter teaspoon of salt, as a give yourself an IV injection type of an idea. In Barbara Handel's book, she said to take a salt crystal, put it in a quart mason jar, and let that salt crystal dissolve until it hits max salinity. So, and then she would tell you to take a tablespoon, or sorry, a full teaspoon of this solution and dump it in a glass of water and drink it in the morning. And they were both using the same formula, because remember, we talked about how max salinity is 25% or 26%. So if you have a quarter teaspoon of salt granules or a teaspoon of max salinity saline water, it's almost the same salt level. And so by adding that to your water in the morning, it would be a way to just kind of get you started off, kind of like you're doing right now with your electrolyte drink at 5:30. It gives the body, all night long our bodies are processing junk, right? It's, even if it's not bad, even if you're eating healthy, our cells still have junk in them every day, which is why the cells are constantly cleaning each other, cleaning the cells. So when we sleep, our bodies, our minds are processing daily trauma, or maybe, even years ago trauma. Our bodies are dealing with all of the pollution that we were around that day. And so our bodies are detoxing at night. And to do that, it needs good, clean salt and good, clean water. So when you wake up in the morning, you go to the bathroom and you're just, getting rid of a lot of this junk that your body is processed overnight.
So when I was with the team in Denver, I saw electrolytes. I saw a big boulder like the one you have there. I saw what I thought was sand, but it was actually ground down salt. And I saw what looked like, table salt, for cooking. So what all is available right now? Meaning, if somebody went to your website, how could they actually consume this stuff?
That's a great question. So the salt in its pure basic form comes in four different varieties. Well, 5 if you count the boulder, the actual crystal. But for consumption, typically the largest that we sell is about the size of a peppercorn. We call that coarse. You could put it in a pepper grinder. You could use it to cake like a prime rib or a big piece of meat. The next size down, we call it kosher size. Now, kosher confuses some people. So, as you know, in Islam, there's halal, which is a, a food purity or cleanliness standard to meet the code of health. And correct me if I'm wrong there. In Judaism, there's a very similar one, and that law of health is called kosher. And in Judaism, blood is not kosher or it's not approved in that cleanliness factor for the religion. And a salt crystal that is a little bit larger flake, like you might see on a pretzel or you might see on a margarita rimmer, that size of flake will suck blood out of meat faster than a finer flake without making the meat overly salty. So that size of crystal is known as koshering salt. It doesn't have anything to do with the Jewish community necessarily. It's just that if you want to suck blood out of a steak, a larger salt crystal, like you'd see on a pretzel or on edamame or on a margarita rimmer, will do that more efficiently. So that size of crystal is known as koshering salt. So if you're ever watching a cooking show or a chef says, grab your kosher salt, they're typically not meaning salt that's set aside for Judaism. They're meaning a salt crystal that is flat and a little bit larger so it'll interact with moisture differently on the top of that steak or on the tomato or on the salad. Then we have the regular fine size, which is your everyday table salt size. And then we have one that's more like confectioner sugar. It's a very fine salt powder that for chips or for popcorn or for brining, that small crystal. So those are the basic sizes. Now with salt, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with salt because we can take freeze dried organic spices, add it to salt, and now you've got a nice garlic salt. A lot of our seasonings today, salt companies or seasoning companies will add sugar to those seasonings for two reasons. One, because everybody has got the sugar craving, or they think they do. And the second is that sugar will offset the bite or the burn in that processed salt, where natural salt will have a sweet flavor when you taste it. A processed salt with the additives has a very sharp or more salty burn type flavor. So a lot of these seasonings will have poor quality salt, then they'll add processed herbs and they'll add flavor enhancers and sugar. Where if you use clean salt and clean food, you don't have to do that. So we have a line of seasoning salts, garlic, onion, a seasoning blend. Salt being hygroscopic, it absorbs moisture. So we have a smoked salt. If you like that smoky flavor, we take a salt crystal like this. You probably can't see it in my hand, but we put that in a smoker and the salt crystals will absorb the smoke. And so it has a very
Wow.
a smoked salt flavor.
This is a hard conversation to have while I'm fasting, by the way, because smoking is like that's one of my it's an Achilles heel for me, and I can't believe you smoked the salt. That sounds incredible.
Yeah, we'll have to get you some of that. But outside of those, then we have a line of electrolyte drinks. You know, years ago I would be giving presentations to soccer groups or to parents of youth athletics, and I would tell them, look, you know, you can make a sports drink for pennies on the dollar. Instead of going to the store and buying the big canister of purple, blue, pink, you know, sugar-filled sports drinks, you can make your own at home by taking a quart of clean water, adding a quarter teaspoon of good, clean, natural salt to it. I prefer Redmond real salt. Add a squeeze of lemon, a little bit of honey or fig syrup, and you have got a sports drink that is going to be every kid's favorite. You know, great for biking, great for working in the garden, firefighting, roofing, and it doesn't have any of those chemicals like a lot of those sports drinks today. But being a company, we realize that's not always handy. And we know that a lot of people are not only deficient in their sodium and chloride, but they're also deficient in potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So we take take the salt, the Redmond real salt, we add a little bit of other electrolytes to it, and then we have a product we call Relight to re-electrolyte. And so it has not only the salt from this ancient seabed, but we'll also add some other electrolytes to it. And then we have a line of electrolyte drinks that you can take this, add it to your water before you head out on a run. You can mix them up while the kids are at the park playing, and it's a great alternative to some of those processed sports drinks that are on the market today.
Yeah, I think people have to appreciate the health need, and I can use my son as an example. He's 13 and pretty athletic and involved in a lot of sports. And at 13, his hair was going white. Not, crazy, but there was a few white hairs, and he had joint pain. And we figured, he's playing a lot of sports. I looked at his genetics, and his mitochondrial function is really great. So it didn't make sense that he had premature graying. So I thought it must be something. Then I realized it's mineral content, because as much as we try to eat as best as possible, he's a 13-year-old boy that's still going to find his snacks and do what his friends do at school behind our backs. And, we're not going to know what's going on there. I got the electrolytes and salts from you guys incorporated into his regimen, right? So I've educated him on it. I got him to switch out his sports drink, and I got him putting a little bit of salt in his food purely for the mineralization. And I got him a little bit of copper. It's been about 2 weeks, and his joint pains are all gone. Right. So this guy's, he's pushing his body hard, and he was mineral poor. He wasn't eating the right stuff, and we provided it. He just wouldn't eat it. And now he has this hack that he loves. Now he himself is sitting there at the table mixing his stuff, and because it has value to him because of his desire to play sports and not be sore, and so the outcome is quick. Within a couple of weeks, this guy there's aches and pains that he's now forgotten about. Right.
It's amazing if you think of how sterile the food is that we get today. And if we were eating, you know, any type of plants, years ago, well, even today, if you have your own garden in your backyard and you're raising carrots and you're getting vegetables, you're going to be getting minerals from the soil because everything isn't so overly sterilized. And yet today live in such a sterilized environment, and the water is ultra purified, which it should be, because oftentimes there's stuff in our water supplies because we're flushing stuff down the toilets we shouldn't be, or whatever. But animals, if we go back to that idea with our ancestors, they weren't in this ultra purified environment. And so not only because we're not using crop rotation are our foods being demineralized over time because we're growing the same thing in the same field at high production rates, that our ancestors didn't. They were, grazing and getting little bits of everything from everywhere. And so one of the beauties of salt, and why animals still today seek out salt, is because yes, there's sodium chloride, but there's also all these other minerals in trace amounts, and none of these amounts are dietary levels. But as you know, on the genetic level, trace amounts of things like copper make a massive difference, even if it is a trace amount.
Yeah, huge difference, and we're not getting enough, and we need to add it, and we don't. Right? There's only so many pills you can take. This is just adding it. You need the water anyway. You might as well add something to it. It's just another way to get something into your system. So Darryl, this was an awesome conversation. If I told anyone we were going to talk about salt for an hour, like, okay, I'm not tuning in this week, but we're going to surprise everybody with this really cool conversation so they get why they need to know. And where do people find you if they wanted to take a look and perhaps order?
Yeah, so Redmond.life, Redmond.life is kind of our main page. If you want to look just at the real salt side, it's just real salt as opposed to fake salt. Just realsalt.com will take you there. And there's a couple of great books. And so if you listen today and you think, wow, Darryl's a crazy, I mean, I probably am crazy, but there's a couple of great books. One is called Salt, A World History. It talks about the history of salt from early man up through today. Fascinating read. Goes into the religious use of salts, the secular uses of salt. And then there's a couple of great books. One is called The Salt Fix by Dr. James D. Nicolantonio. there's another one that's called Salt Your Way to Health by Dr. David Brownstein. And so I really appreciate you having me on today. I think salt is really cool. It like you said, who would have thought we could have talked about salt for an hour? But I think salt's the essence of life, and I think if we all just were a little more intentional and listen to our bodies and listen to our intuition, to our cravings, I think would be nicer to each other, and I think would probably be healthier as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Darryl. It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and hope everybody learned a little bit. Thank you again. Great conversation.